All right, everyone, welcome back. Today we're talking about TV shows that were canceled way too soon. Chris tries to scare me yet again with stories about tidal waves. And a sea of 1,000 drunken Mrs. Ropers?
Trying to find some way to go to sleep, and of course, invariably, I do all the things that you're not supposed to do, right? But which again leads me back to the television, and back to what can I find what can I stream, right? Because there's certainly nothing anywhere, and regular television. And I know you don't even have regular television. You just stream. You stay away from you stay away from the networks like they were programmed by Sammy Hagar. But anyway.
Yep.
But looking at, and we talked a while back about some of these shows. Remember the ones that I dug out, like the Krofft Supershow and all the rest of this stuff.
Yeah.
Because now when a show comes on, right, it can have like a long life, or it can have a season that might be like 10 episodes, and then it'll shut down and it'll come back a year later. That is the good part about it. There are all these differences now with, right? A show doesn't have to like get great ratings within like 4 episodes. There were shows that used to get canceled, right? Like after 1 episode. Or 2 episodes because nobody was watching, and boom, we got to move on to the next thing. But there were these shows, and I'm guessing you had some. I certainly had some that I liked, and this is a cool show. And again, but for whatever reason, maybe I was the only person that was watching it, or there definitely weren't enough people watching it, and it got canceled, right? And when you're talking about canceled, that means it's gone, right? I mean, I'm talking about showing up on a DVD later, or showing up on some other sort of, or maybe I'm just not looking in the right place. But I'm looking at shows or thinking about shows that were great, and what happened to them? Or did I imagine those? Did those shows even exist? Because I can't find, I guess I can Google up, I can find it maybe on Wikipedia or something, and then I know I'm not a complete madman. But these shows they're like the lost art. It would take Indiana Jones to go dig them out and find them, and to be able to say, and maybe they wouldn't be as good as I remembered because I was 13 years old at the time. But where are those shows, Jeff? And do you have any shows like that? Is there anything or you in your creative pursuits going, I'd really like to reboot this show if I could somehow get the rights and turn it into a web series or a streaming series like you have done in the past? Name a show. There's got to be a show out there that you would say, I'm going to bring, if I can't see it, if I can't bring it back to life, at least I can see it. Give me a show. Tell me a show.
There's so many of them. I mean, and it was always so disappointing, like you said, because you would see the show, you'd go, oh my God, I actually like this, this is really cool. And then by the 2nd or 3rd episode, you're kind of getting into the swing of it. 5th or 6th episode, if it's going, you're like, oh man, this is so cool. You'd get so excited. You'd want to be home at the right time because, again, that's how you watch something. You had to be in front of it while it was airing. Mm-hmm. And then it's just not there, right? The next Thursday at, 8:00 at night, it's just gone. And you look in the TV guide and you're like, hey, what the hell just happened, man? Where's my, Salvage 1? What happened to Salvage 1? Damn it. I want to see what's going to happen with, Andy Griffith creating a salvage company, building his own spaceship and going to the moon, right? Look, I don't know if that show in particular holds up to this day, but what a great idea. Do you remember Salvage 1?
I think at that point in our lives, Andy Griffith was one of those guys that we were familiar with Andy Griffith literally our entire lives, right? Because he had already existed on reruns that showed up because of a show that was on in like the 60s before we were even born, or the early 60s. But I absolutely remember that show because, again, it's one of those he was a junk man, and did he get like rocket parts or something and then build his own? Because I think it was something that, and he became something else. It's like, and first of all, let's take him one step back and go, we already had Fred Sanford, right? So somehow, somebody decided that a lead character who was a junk man, maybe be a junk person, was a lead in the show, right? So again, very high concept. It's like we had doctors and we had lawyers and we had detectives and we had, Johnny Gage and Roy DeSoto from Emergency, right? You had all these like heroic sort of, right, whatever. But Junkman, we had it. But this, I guess, Fred Sanford was the comedic Junkman, and Andy Griffith was a Junkman who, yes, built a rocket, I think, from parts. And then, how was that a show? But it was a show. Like, were we tuning in? Were you tuning in every week to decide what's he going to build next? Right? Is he going to build a hovercraft, a transporter? Talk to me about Salvage One. Why did it draw you in, Jeff?
Yeah, I guess we'll never know. But I mean, it's you say that about the junk man, and you're absolutely correct. But what's so interesting about TV shows, right, is the premise is one thing, the story is something else, right? So obviously, Red Fox in Sanford and Son, you could have put him in any situation. The show is just about his hilarious outlook on life, and then his son plays the comedic foil, right? Dad,
Right.
come on, So he could have been in a junkyard or any place. With Andy Griffith, and by the way, Andy Griffith, guys, the last guy that Chris and I would ever look towards as a awesome comedic action adventure kind of a guy, right? That's not the show you would think of for Andy Griffith. But the idea was pretty clever, right? Just like in all of these 60s and 70s and 80s shows, it was high concept. And so high concept would be, my nanny is a supernatural being, Chris, not a witch. Or it could be Andy Griffith owns this giant salvage yard, but he also has a background with NASA, is my recollection, and he's an engineer.
Okay.
And he realizes that there's a bunch of stuff on the moon that's worth a whole bunch of money. Now, I think part of it was all the Apollo stuff that was left behind, which I can't really imagine is worth that much. But I think it was also like he was going to mine on the moon and get minerals and stuff. And so the fun part was he actually built a mother effing spaceship and went to the moon, and nobody thought he could. And, everyone else is scratching their head and freaking out, and, the space agency, and I'm sure the military.
A government agent who's in charge of the case.
Yeah, government agent, of course.
Right.
You got to have that.
Right.
And you know what, Chris? It's probably a classic case of, just like you said, the show went past the initial idea that got it greenlit, and then it got to a point where people were like, now what the fuck's he going to do? So, okay, you went there. All right, now what?
Right.
Oh, we didn't think you'd have to, ask us for more episodes after that. And to get on a tangent here, which I guess is part of our show's purpose, it reminds me so much of Lloyd Bridges in Sea Hunt, right? Wasn't it called Sea Hunt? Or did I get that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Lloyd Bridges was a scuba diver, a diver.
A frogman. A frogman, Jeff.
And they had the opposite opinion, right? They greenlit Salvage One with no problem. Green light, you can make a TV series. I love it. A junk man builds a spaceship. But with the show Sea Hunt, they had a hard time pitching that, because what they said was, all right, dude, now what happens? You might have one or two adventures underwater, but who the fuck is going to watch a show where every episode something happens under? How many goddamn things can even happen underwater? Seriously. And Sea Hunt was like,
right,
fuck you. I'll show you how many things can happen underwater. That show became the number one show in the world and launched Lloyd Bridges to superstardom. And you bet your damn whatever, he could do all kinds of stuff underwater. Don't even start asking that question. You see what happens.
Right.
Anyway.
And wherever he lived, obviously, man, there's a lot of problems down by the bay. Stay out of there, because inland there was nothing going on. But he was useless to you, right? It's just like, hey, we got this crime out on this farm. It's like, well, I can't help you, but if you need me to, dive into a pond, maybe, it's like, yeah, you're right. So the whole premise, pretty damn narrow. Whatever he was, I don't even know what he was on Sea Hunt. All I know is that he could scuba dive, right? Which at the time was pretty cool,
Chris, that's all you need.
right? I don't think that I don't think you could take scuba lessons anywhere. Nobody went on vacation and scuba dived, dove. Nobody did those, I don't think, at least at that time. So it was really like unusual. Again, he might as well have, like, as we've talked about, may as well have had a jetpack. It was the same kind of thing. He's not in space. He's down in the ocean, which the same thing.
Don't forget, we were fascinated by underwater. Yeah.
Right. But what was his job? Was he like a fisherman?
I don't know.
Did he have the charter boats? Because it's like not like he had a lot of, but hey, we need, for whatever his, again, we needed his scuba prowess. But you would turn these, and a lot of these shows, and some of them went on for a long time, not even the short live shows we're talking about, but you could have a show that the character, much like a junk man who is like building rockets, and the only one who thinks like, hey, that shit up on the moon is valuable. So I'm not going to go and like look for hubcaps or scrapped cars. I'm going to go get some serious stuff that's expensive and worth a lot on the moon. But again, it's this conceit where this junk man becomes this heroic character. And I bet you, I'm sure there was fights and fist fights and whatever sort of car chases, whatever you needed to move the plot along. But you looked at a show like, and I'll just throw this one out there, that was on for a long time. When you had a show like Quincy, he was like the medical examiner, right? Which is like, they had a whole show based on the guy who like looks at like the dead bodies, who would, and then actually the cops were stupid. And then he would get in fights and he would solve crimes and he would make out with the chicks. And it was like, but he's the coroner. You know what I mean? So it was like so it was like, we're going to make him the main character. There are coroners on all these shows the last, I don't know how long Law and Order's been on, like 40 years. It's like, there's always a coroner and they go for them and say, oh yeah, they died at, 3:53 a.m. and they were killed with a blanket, and that's basically it. But instead, so you took these characters and turned them into, and I guess that's where you get a sea hunt. That's where you get a salvage, right? But that's awesome. I remember the show, but I think I remember his Ritz cracker commercials more.
Everything's good when it's sitting on a Ritz.
Good cracker.
That's a good cracker. Yeah, the whole sea hunt thing where the only way he can be effective, right, is to do things underwater, right? So you have to kind of bend the script to get him to go underwater every episode. It reminds me of the crime boat on the Simpsons, right? It's an imaginary TV show that's kind of like Knight Rider, but every single time the crime boat, it always finds a way to get the bad guys. And in one of the episodes, it captures them, and the bad guys are always like, damn it, there's always some kind of a peninsula or an inlet or a fjord or some way for that boat to catch us. Damn it. And I remember there was a kid at my house when we were watching Sea Hunt, and somebody was sassing the main character, like bullying him, in the show, right? Some of the thugs. And one of the kids that was in the room with me said, you just wait until you get underwater. I'd like to see you try that underwater. I'm like, what? Hitting him? Underwater? I'm like, oh yeah, you just wait until they go underwater. Then you'll see what happens. So what other shows, Chris? We barely scratched the surface. What's a show that you wished hadn't ended so early?
Well, there were several, but there was one in particular because it came off of a show that tried to. Okay, we remember on the heels of Star Wars when Battlestar Galactica came out, right? And it was very clearly inspired by Star Wars. It was a big deal, and Sunday nights had this whole, the whole mythology. They had the look and feel of, they had, instead of stormtroopers, they had Cylons, right? And the spaceships looked, instead of X-wings, they had Vipers, and it was this whole thing about this search. But again, but they also had these really interesting helmets that sort of look like a King Tut sort of pharaoh, so that, and then they were searching for this mythical planet called Earth, right? And so the whole premise was like, the whole thing is, if you think about it, it was just like, okay, so they have all this, like they have like this Egyptian thing. Did they build the pyramids? Are they eventually going to get to Earth and do whatever, But I don't think Battlestar Galactica lasted for more than a couple of years. I don't even know. I'd have to go back and check. But I don't think that one wasn't necessary. But again, it was fairly popular. They rebooted it several years ago with a completely different tone, right? And it becomes like a hardcore sci-fi thing, and it was a huge hit. Never watched it. But I don't know, a year or two later, after Battlestar Galactica, and 13-year-old me was like bummed out that it disappeared. All of a sudden, I see a commercial one day for Galactica 1980. And of course, this was in like 1980. And here, the premise is that they found Earth, and it's a couple of people. It's the kid who was like a kid in the original Battlestar Galactica. Like, he's grown up, okay? And he's one of the protagonists, and they come and they're like on Earth, and they bring Cylons are chasing them and everything else. First of all, it kind of blew the whole, well, I thought they built the pyramids kind of thing, right? What happened here? Because now it's the 1980s, and they've got guys from Battlestar Galactica are, bumping around with Cylons, and, the Capitol Records building gets like shot up. Anyway,
What?
and I don't know if you remember, yes, Galactica 1980.
What is
very
this
short
show?
live.
My God, how did I not ever hear about this?
And the star of Galactica 1980 was none other than Kent McCord from Adam 12.
Okay.
Right? So,
okay.
and,
yeah. All right. I'm
his,
starting to remember. Okay.
Yes, he's the grown-up annoying kid from the original series who was the son of Richard Hatch or whatever. And then
the one that had the one that had the Doggett, right? Which was the little dog.
Daggett. The Daggett. Yes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. The Daggett.
Yes. The R2-D2 ripoff. Exactly. Everything in Battlestar Galactica had a Star Wars equivalent.
And Kent McCord
from Adam 12, right?
Yeah,
and
right on.
His partner was a guy named Barry Van Dyke, who was like the young, strapping, muscular son of Dick Van Dyke, and he kind of Van Dyke-ish looking, but anyway.
Oh, so Jerry Van Dyke.
Gary Van Dyke. Jerry Van
thank
Dyke
God. Okay, because Jerry Van
Barry,
Dyke. Yeah.
Barry.
Oh, Barry. Jerry,
right, no.
Barry, and Gary. I love it. There's a lot of weird Van Dykes floating around out there.
There's a lot of those, right? But anyway, go ahead. You were going to say.
I was going to say, speaking of Jerry Van Dyke, since we're talking about weird shows that only had 1 or 2 episodes and then disappeared. I mean, Battlestar Galactica, obviously that doesn't really qualify, but that wasn't your point. Your point was Galactica 1980, which
Galactica 1980.
Weird. Yeah, that must have lasted, what, 4 episodes or something, or less than a season? But
yeah, 4 or
Jerry
6,
Van
maybe.
Dyke, back in the black and white days, he was in a TV show called My Mom, the Car. My Mom, the Car. And his mother dies and gets reincarnated into like a Model A Ford or a Model T Ford. And so he drives it around, and the whole time she's like, oh, goodness, you're touching my pedals. Oh, my. And the whole thing is just like really creepy and really strange. It's like you're sitting in your mom and she's a car. Like, you're just trying to imagine the pitch session on this. It's just so insane. And what a shock. It didn't last very long, right? But yeah, Jerry Van Dyke, hilarious.
You're touching your mom's pedals.
Right?
Yeah, I don't want to.
She would even say things that are like weirdly sexual. They're like, hey, watch out. You're touching my, it's like, oh, gross, mom. Well, that you stumped me on that one, Chris. I had never heard of Galactica 1980, so you got me on that one, man. How about this one that I think you and I both really liked? And man, I think what got maybe 7 or 8 episodes. I have to look it up. But how about Square Pegs?
Square Pegs was great.
And I think Bill Murray was in one of the first episodes, maybe as the teacher or the substitute teacher or something, just to kind of kick it off. But wow, that was a fun show.
Because it was created by a woman named Ann Beats, who was like a writer from Saturday Night Live, in that time, when Saturday Night Live launched. Okay, so mid-70s. So yeah, and no, it was great. It had like the same kind of, and I want to say the kids were probably about our age, thereabouts.
Yeah, they were.
It had the nerdy kids, right? There was a. This is funny. There was a punk character, and I'm doing air quotes, called Johnny Slash. Okay, so it was like, okay, that was interesting, and he didn't look anything like an actual punk rocker, but he looked like a primetime TV version of a punk rocker. But yeah, Sarah Jessica Parker, I believe, not an enormous fan of hers in modern times,
No,
But
sir.
yeah, kids in high school, nerdy kids trying to fit in, the cool kids, the jock kids, but it was irreverent. It was pretty smart. And the kids were much more interesting than like some kid on some other lame, they were more like a real kid. And the music was really good. I want to
Really
say,
good music,
I don't know,
yeah.
you would probably know better than me. I don't know if Mark Smothersbaugh had anything to do with the music. Somebody along in that milieu, I think, did
Yeah.
music for it. So yeah,
Okay.
great show. I think it was actually, the critics said, yeah, it was good, and nobody watched it. And
No, exactly.
and
It kind of had that like 16 Candles sensibility, right? Almost
mhm.
like an Anthony
Right.
Michael Hall, wisecracking John Cusack, kind of a really quick-witted. But to their credit, I mean, the stars of the show were the two girls, which back then was a little more rare. That was kind of cool. And I can't remember who was the other
Right. Excellent point. I
actress.
was just going to say that as a great point.
Sarah Jessica Parker and someone else. And as far as I can tell, in terms of Sarah Jessica Parker projects that I've enjoyed, other than Square Pegs, that would be 0. 0.0 would be how many things I've enjoyed her in since that show. Now, that is probably going to have to go into the same file as Adam Levine or Ryan Seacrest or Howie Long, where I can't necessarily pin down my irrational, I wouldn't even call it dislike, my unimpressedness, my me not like their contribution to entertainment thing. But holy shit, man, she is not doing well on the Jeff meter. And probably the nicest person in the world, as I always say.
No, I agree. No, I can't tell you that I ever watched anything that was actually that I enjoyed that she was in. I think she was in LA Story with Steve Martin. Was it actually pretty good?
She was. I love that movie.
I think she had
I think she mostly just spun around in circles during that film, but
she was a supporting character. I think. Go ahead.
All I was gonna say is in the science fiction world, there were a couple of cool little standouts there. Science fiction, of course, being so popular. One of them, pretty sure this was around the Star Wars era with Richard Benjamin. I know what you know what I'm going to say, Chris. The movie Quark, right? And it was an absolute comedy from the get-go, right? He was like had a spaceship, but the spaceship, here we go, back to the junk man. The spaceship is a garbage scowl, right? It's an actual garbage ship.
It? Okay.
It went around the galaxy picking up people's garbage. That was its job. So just like the junkyard or just like the salvage dealer, we were obsessed back then, apparently, with junk and garbage collectors and dealers and distributors of. But it was so well done. And Richard Benjamin was really freaking funny. And he had two very cute twins back then. Chris, I think you know who they were.
The Doublemint twins, right?
The Doublemint twins, yeah.
Trish and Sib. Sib, I guess Sib is short for Sybil. Yeah, they were the Doublemint twins. Yeah. They were like androids, though, right? They were like sexy androids. That I think the uncomfortable implication was that, they'll do anything you want, and it was just like, but it's not a real person. But and there was a Spock.
I was comfortable with that, Chris. I just want to go on record as letting you know that I had no discomfort at all with that idea. I was comfortable with it. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Right. There was like a Spock kind of character that was like a bird or something.
No, he was a plant.
A plant.
He was technically a plant.
Ficus.
And so there was all kinds of jokes about him needing lots of sunlight and having to stand in dirt every once in a while. It was a funny show. It was. I mean, it's silly by today's standards, but damn, it was clever. But, again, it went away so quick. Then you had other shows that were comedies that came and went in the Mel Brooks kind of genre there, which was When Things Were Rotten. Do you remember that one? When Things Were Rotten? Mm-hmm. It was a Robin Hood show.
Robin Hood. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember it vaguely.
Kind of a precursor of the whole Men in Tights concept. But
Robin Hood, Men in Tights. Yeah. I think you got a do-over with that, right?
It was a lot of fun, man. It was just like kooky characters, right? And I think that if we continue with comedies that came and went that were very clever but just didn't quite hit, You and I are both big fans of the Police Squad, not Police Academy,
Police
but Police
Squad.
Squad with not
Police
Leslie
Squad.
Nielsen, Jesus, Jeff, with you know who
Yeah.
I'm talking about, Leslie something.
You're talking about Leslie Nielsen. Yeah, you had
it is Nielsen.
You had it right the first time.
Oh.
Yes.
I tripped myself up because I was thinking of Liam Neeson and getting it confused in my brain with Leslie Nielsen. Okay, I had it right the first time.
Well, I think you may have read. I think I read something that they're rebooting that with Liam Neeson, and that's probably why you had that on your brain.
Are you kidding? Is that true?
But I'm not kidding. I hate for actual modern news to get into this podcast, but yes. No, Police Squad, very funny. Again, now this has got Leslie Nielsen. I don't know if we've ever talked about Airplane on this show, but right, he was one of those guys that had been a previously serious actor, right? And then he and Robert Stack, right, and Peter Graves, and I don't know who else you want to, and Lloyd Bridges, right? They all got cast in Airplane, and in these everything in Airplane was ridiculous.
Right.
Airplane, have we talked about that? Still holds up. I think that the 14-year-old in me.
Absolutely.
And I saw something, again, not to get into too much modern news, the other day, where it has some sort of record because there's like 12 or 13 jokes per minute or something like that. Where somebody went and did the metrics on like,
wow.
So anyway, I don't know what the numbers are specifically, but, so they took all these old character actors. Leslie Nielsen was like a serious actor who would get in, he would be the bad guy on like Canon, right?
Yeah.
Or some show like that, Barnaby Jones, right? One of those shows. Okay. And then he was the captain. I guess I didn't remember this. He was the captain of the ocean liner that capsized in Poseidon Adventure. Okay,
yes.
so
let's not relive that nightmare. You know how sensitive I am about that. Okay,
that's
my scariest movie of all time.
That's why you won't go on a cruise to this day, right?
Rogue waves, Chris. They're real.
Like quicksand. It's like, damn it, I know sooner or later quicksand is going to get me.
Yeah, we were all going to die from quicksand. Yeah,
all that shit that my brother tried to tell me. So Leslie Nielsen goes from Airplane to Police Squad, which was the same people who did it, right?
Yeah.
Didn't last. The shows were hilarious. The shows were crude. They were hitting that sort of joke, and they were maybe just a little bit too much for your average TV viewer because it was just nonstop jokes and ridiculous kind of situations. Got canceled, but thankfully, yes, they realized and made, I don't know, 3-4 Police Squad Naked Gun movies, right?
Yeah.
And so that was much like, again, so they got a do-over with that, just like Robin Hood Men in Tights came from When Things Were Rotten. And I guess when you're Mel Brooks or you're the Zucker brothers or something like that, you can do that, right? You can kind of say, you got anything else? It's like, yeah, I've got this. I'm kind of sitting on and I'd like to try this again, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's the thing that was interesting because, again, these shows, lasted a handful of episodes or maybe they lasted a season, right? But that's when I didn't even know what the term short-lived meant because I read it phonetically. Is that short-lived? And some people may even can pronounce it as short-lived, but I always think of if somebody had a short-lived career in politics or a short-lived musical career, but I always think of TV shows that went, away before anybody watched them. And I think that's the beauty now, because now the shows have done that. The Office and Seinfeld, and I think even these shows that they stream, they can build an audience and they can do 8 or 10 episodes and they can come back and then people will come back and watch, or they're given time to breathe a little bit. Right.
Yeah.
One show that I liked, and I think the one thing that was, I think we took for granted a little bit, because I think when we always wonder where these ideas come from, and we know they're always not the most original ideas, but there were a lot of shows that were based on movies, right? Oh, it's a hit movie. Boom. Let's tone it down and see if we can get some of the actors. I mean, maybe the most famous version of that was MASH, right? Which was based on a movie, which was based on a book. And probably, the best movie that had ever been, they tried with Planet of the Apes, didn't really work, right? Too expensive and whatnot. But I remember very specifically when they made a TV version of Animal House. Do you remember this? It was called Delta House.
Yep.
Okay.
I do.
And Michelle Pfeiffer was in it. So it gets points for giving Michelle Pfeiffer one of her first gigs. and it had like 2 or 3 of the characters that, the ancillary characters. You didn't get Tim Matheson, and you didn't get John Belushi, or you didn't get the main, so you got like the guys that played like Hoover and Flounder and D-Day, right?
Yeah.
So
right.
secondary characters.
Oh, the guy that plays
And
D-Day, he's up for anything. Yeah, that guy will be in your show.
Yeah,
Sure.
Bruce McGill, he's one of those guys. That guy's probably got a pretty fat
Well
bank
done.
account. He's in, because he's in legit movies. He's in like Michael Mann movies and stuff like that. Is he still alive? I think he's still alive. But it's think about it, it's like, but you're at that point, you're literally trying to cash in, right? Because think about it, we've had the conversations about Animal House and how it doesn't specifically, and it's a little bit problematic in 2024. But how did you even at the time in 1978, 79, let's make this a television show?
Yeah, you
right?
can't.
Let's
can't.
take these wild, drunken, sex-obsessed, college fraternity guys, and they're the heroes, right? They're the heroes and I don't think it lasted very long. Never got a sequel to Animal House, which is kind of amazing when you think about it, or even an update or a reboot. But I think about there were shows like that again, I remember there was an Animal House show, right? It's called Delta House. I don't know why they didn't call it Animal House, because they got the rights to everything else. But that I remember that is kind of like it was there and then it was gone. And then it's just, I guess I was the only person watching this show, right? That and Michelle Pfeiffer's parents. Yes.
Right. Was that a show? Michelle Pfeiffer's parents? I don't remember that show, Chris.
It could have been. I would have watched that because maybe she had guest starred from time to time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're right. And that another one that I wouldn't say famously was a spinoff from the movie, but I liked it, was Logan's Run, was actually a TV series for a while. And, I mean, you could go anywhere with that, but honestly, the movie Logan's Run kind of played it out, right? There's this city in the future. It's all self-contained in a dome. The way they control the population is anyone that becomes 30 years of age is just killed. And everyone believes that you're kind of recycled or reincarnated, but that just doesn't happen. And in the end, they figure out that there is an outside world and they were all hornswoggled by God. And now what? Well, let's have the series. Okay. And it was a good series, but I mean, I don't know how far you can take it or what was going to happen next. But yeah, that one kind of fizzled out too.
And I think like you had the little flower in the palm of their hand, right? And it was like this utopia, right? Where you could do anything you want up until you turn 30, right? And that was the whole premise. And then you had this little flower in your hand, and then it turned black, and that was like, okay, Logan.
It actually went clear.
Did it go clear? Okay.
Happened.
I was going to say,
yeah.
Jeff, your flower's up. Time to go get in the carousel, and you're going to float to the top, and you're going to just like kind of, it was like a show, right? It was like, hey, let's go watch, and people would sit there and scream because then you were like, the implication was that you'd be coming back and you'd be reincarnated, right? Renewed, right?
But if you tried to run, Chris, what happened if you tried to run? You could also decide
the Sandmen
would come get you. That was the police department there. Yeah.
They had that cool uniform, right? It was like all black with like that gray like stripe across the middle of the chest, right? They had those really cool guns. Okay. And again, that was another one of those shows. Again, the premise was based on sort of like a journey because I think Logan and it was Gregory Harrison, I think, before, one of his early shows. So Logan and the chick and then the robot, an android, were like running, and then he was being chased by his former friend because the Sandman can't run, right? The Sandman was the people who chased the runners. So the whole show was just like a chase.
And they would even say, "Run, runner." They wanted them to run. Yeah.
Right.
Run, runner.
Right.
Yeah, no, that show could have gone places. Another one that we had talked about briefly in the last episode, just because of its, I would say, like, kind of risque sexual tones in it, was the show UFO, which was such a cool concept, right? The idea was in a Hollywood studio, it's just a front, right? This Hollywood studio is just a veneer, and underground beneath the studio is secretly the Shadow organization that protects Earth from alien invasions, right? So the head of the studio is actually the head of this organization, and they have vehicles that can go underwater, on the land, in the air, and they even have a base on the moon, as I mentioned last episode, populated by obviously smoking hot British actresses who are wearing next to nothing. And that was kind of the show's weird, like, appeal. It was almost like the Benny Hill show. It's like, how can we get these people in the skimpiest,
Nice pull.
tightest clothes you can possibly imagine? And like I said, you had entire episodes where you're like, oh, okay, I guess they're taking off their clothes now. And you're like, as a kid, when you're like, whatever, 11 or 12, you're like, huh? There wasn't any actual nudity, but it was kind of R-rated-ish and really cool, high-level sci-fi, and yeah, the cool British accents and weird technology. Yeah. And man, that was a great show. But it didn't last too long, unfortunately.
Well, it reminds me of Space 1999, right? Which was, I think, same sort of in that same time period. I want to say same people produced that show. That was like the moon. They were like on a moon base, and then there was something happened, and the moon like just blew or just like got out of Earth's orbit.
It did.
Right. And so it kind of spun off into space, and that's where they had all their adventures. Right. Mm-hmm. Again, had like the cool, suits and service of British accents thrown in there, even though it was like Martin Landau and his wife, Barbara Bain, who had been from Mission Impossible. Right. They were like the stars, but they were like the only Americans on that. Right. Everybody else was like British. And although I even remember, although somebody telling me, and again, it may have been my brother who liked to ruin stuff and talk about quicksand and killer bees, that if that did happen, if the moon did, just get out of Earth's orbit,
eject from its orbit, yeah,
down on Earth, you'd have tidal waves and have all kinds of weird natural disasters.
Chris, I'm going to ask you for the second time to refrain from talking about tidal waves. Can you do that for me? Can you stop talking about tidal waves, my ultimate fear besides little tiny demons and Oompa Loompas? Second only to that, tidal waves.
Hey, there is a tsunami warning sign 2 miles from where I am sitting right now. Okay, I have to drive past that all the time.
Well, there you did. You did it 3 times.
Okay, and it's standard there. It's at Moonlight Beach. Wow. So not that, and it's a standing sign. Okay, I'll skip over tidal waves.
Please, let's not talk about it. Chris, I have one for you that I don't think we've ever talked about, and I'm really curious if you remember this. So this was a Saturday morning live action TV show, right? This would be on the same level as Wonderbug, right? Or something like that, right? Or Dr. Shrinker, like we've talked about. So this one was called The Kids from Caper. Remember The Kids from Caper? Is that too obscure?
It was
very short.
Are you sure that wasn't happening in your mind?
I promise. And Caper was some kind of an acronym. So what it was like a Scooby-Doo detective team, but it was all guys. And it was really funny. Like they actually had very witty, super sarcastic, really funny scenes. They each had their own powers. One of them was really good looking, and every time a woman would look at him, everything would go slow-mo, and she would suddenly be in a romance novel. The other guy had the strength of animals. The other guy could do something, they had the classic bookworm guy with giant glasses. Anyway, it was really fucking funny. It was a great show, and they had a great theme song. But I was just curious if you'd ever heard of that. I was sad to see that one disappear.
But that was a Saturday morning show.
It was, Saturday morning live action, kind of like Captain Cool and the Kongs or something, like that kind of a thing.
Right,
yeah.
Bigfoot and Wild Boy.
Well, maybe not Bigfoot and Wild Boy. Maybe not that.
Of course not. Of course not.
Well, and then there were shows that were high concept science fiction that were also really cool. 2 of them that were kind of similar, Chris. There was a huge fascination back in those shows with invisibility. That was a big deal, right? And so one of them was Gemini Man. You ever see Gemini Man?
I remember it. I think he had some sort of device that made him turn invisible, and
It was.
it was an accident, or I don't know. And he had to. It was the
Well-
one where he wasn't like, it was like a normal guy who then has to become like an agent because he can do this or something like that. Am I or was he always like a federal agent?
I can't remember how he got the device, but the device was a watch. And the watch could render you invisible. And the catch is if you stay invisible for more than 15 minutes, I love that catch, then you'll stay invisible forever, right? So this is basically what I call the Ultraman catch. So the live action TV show, science fiction, back when you and I were kids, they called Ultraman. You ever see Ultraman?
Yes.
So in Ultraman, this man, Hayato, Japanese show, pretty cool. He works for the Science Patrol, and they're normally patrolling Earth for giant monsters, protecting the Earth. But when giant monsters do appear, Hayato is able to activate, Chris, the beta capsule. And when he activates the beta capsule, he grows to the size of Godzilla, and he's in this really cool, space age armor, and his chest glows, and he becomes Ultraman, and he does all these sort of cool karate moves on these really silly looking LSD acid trip, Sid and Marty Krofft looking things. But the same thing, Chris, once his power starts to diminish, he can only stay Ultraman for so long. His chest starts blinking, and man, Chris, if he doesn't go back to Hayato and go back to his original form, he'll die, Chris. And so I would literally get so scared during those battles when I saw his chest blinking.
You get stressed out.
Boop, boop. I'm like, oh man, I would just like run outside. Tell me what happens, man. I can't even look. I was so worried. Same thing though, right? 15 minutes, you're screwed. I love it how they put the weakness in there.
Interesting that 15 minutes is the marker, I guess. But I guess that makes sense because that's enough tension within a 60-minute show, right? Because if it went longer,
right,
that you'd have to go into the next episode, or 15. If you can't really do a lot in 15, what can you do in 15 minutes? Maybe that's the point too. It's just like, I can go in there and save her, but as I look at my watch now, I've got 14 minutes and 11 seconds. Okay, I've got 14:10. I'm running out of time here, literally, right? When somebody's saying they're running out of time.
Well, and then watches were a big gimmick back then, because I remember there being a movie where, again, Pam Dauber was in it. I was so in love with her at the time, but it was called The Girl, the Gold Watch, and Everything. And it was a made-for-TV movie starring Robert Hayes of Airplane.
I was going to say Robert Hayes, okay.
And Pam Dauber, and he had a pocket watch that he inherited from his crazy uncle, who was an inventor. And when you click it, time stops, right? It doesn't turn you invisible, but time stops, and then you can walk around and manipulate time and go back to the way you were. So always love those high concept shows, right? Where there's some gadget or gimmick that allows you to do something.
You always loved yourself some Pam Dauber, I think, is also the critical part there.
I sure do. Yes, sirree.
Yeah, I mean, the watch was, right. The watch was quite a gimmick, right? And maybe it was easy, and probably from a prop perspective, it's like, well, we can come up with a watch and we can make it look, super cool and do whatever. I remember also, and this was probably a little bit later when we were, there was a show called Crime Story, okay? And it was and it was created by Michael Mann. And I think he did this before he did Miami Vice, okay? And before he did, his movies like Heat and Last of the Mohicans and everything else. So Crime Story, it was like set in the 50s, and it was like a whole sort of, they were cops who wore trench coats and hats, and they solved, and they had and it was an ongoing thing against a gangster. And Dennis Farina, I don't know if you remember good old Dennis Farina, who became a pretty well-known character actor, had actually been a cop, I understand. He was a cop and then became an actor. And it had 50s music. Runaway by Del Shannon was the theme song, right?
Oh, I remember that show.
Cool.
Yeah,
they looked
yeah.
super cool. They drove the super cool 50s cars. And again, they were, fedoras and
super stylistic,
and super, and just really good. way too good for television. I think that's
Yeah.
partly some of the things that some of you are talking about. They're too good for television. So people don't appreciate it. People want, Jack, Janet, and Chrissy trying to like convince the Ropers that what they just saw didn't happen. You know what I mean? They want these simple sort of
Chris,
plots.
that is good fun.
That,
Come on now.
it is, right? Some sort of major misunderstanding. But I mean, you could have criticized it, like it was too good for television. And then obviously Michael Mann probably proved that because he went and did Miami Vice and then did all these films. To this day, he's still doing. Heat's one of my favorite films. I think it's a phenomenal film. But it was just gone because it was just 60 minutes, and it was a hour-long show. It's probably expensive to produce, and it had a story arc. It was one of those first ones that had an arc. It's like nothing got solved at the end of the episode, right? Because they were still chasing this criminal and still trying to catch him. It was like they could catch the small fish. That guy's a small fish, but the big fish got away.
That's serial programming versus episodic, right? We're used to episodic where everything gets resolved in that episode, right? Again, like I Dream of Jeannie or Green Acres. But serial shows were interesting, right? Because sometimes some things would get resolved a little bit, but there were these larger stories that had to unwind over time, which was really, really cool. Yeah. And I love that. That Del Shannon song was such a perfect song for that show. Yeah, really, really cool. Yeah, shows that got canceled way too early that were too good for us.
We didn't appreciate what we had.
Chris, I will say two things. Number one, we've barely cracked the surface of shows that went away too quickly. I think we could safely spill this over into another episode. We have plenty more where that came from. But number two, just on the subject of Three's Company, which did actually have a long run, I just want to let everyone know out there that it makes my heart feel so good that there is a thing called the Mrs. Roper pub crawl. And I want everyone to listen to what I'm saying now. This is a real thing, and it's very popular. Not hundreds, thousands of people all dress up as Mrs. Roper from the show Three's Company. Why? Because it's the perfect pub crawl outfit. It's a giant flowery muumuu. For whatever reason, her character always wore a big muumuu. I don't know why. And she has that super tight red curly hair, which was clearly like a little Orphan Annie wig, right? And just crazy jewelry, right? And so you dress up and you just go from bar to bar. And I'm just trying to imagine, right, in these gas lamp districts, just having hundreds and hundreds of Mrs. Ropers walking in. But every year it gets bigger. It's like Sturgis or something with bikers. So to me, that just makes me feel good to know that the world has gotten that weird. God bless the Mrs. Roper pub crawl or whatever they call it.
It's like Lollapalooza.
Oh, yeah, of course.
The most recent one in last month had over 1,000 Mrs. Ropers. It was in Philadelphia, and you're right. And I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that probably not all of the Ropers, Mrs. Ropers, were Mrs.'s, right? Because I'm sure there was a lot of guys in there that threw on the wig and threw on the muumuu, and they just don't make Mrs. Ropers anymore. No, there's a lot more shows, a lot of things like that we could talk to that, again, obscure, that, I never envisioned myself talking about decades later. And maybe it is just a bit of an interesting phenomenon because, again, shows didn't get a chance to grow. Shows didn't get a chance to find the audience. Shows didn't get a chance people didn't get it. If there was somebody who just, understood the Brady Bunch was a high concept. And it's not a dig at the Brady Bunch, but let's take it for what it was, right? So you have the wrong people in charge, and those shows, just they didn't get a chance.
Well, a lot of those shows were thrown around to different time slots too. So
absolutely,
we don't know. Sometimes it was just death by schedule.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, shoot, man. I think we covered some good ground there. Blew out the back of my brain on some very, very interesting memories. Galactica, 1980, never heard of it. Totally forgot that there was a Delta House spinoff from Animal House. And so thank you, Chris, for tickling the back of my brain there.
Of course.
And again, If we can get at least 4 or 5 of those every episode, that's pretty cool. What do you think, man? Until next time?
Until next time, Jeff.